VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And we thank you for joining us today on Crosstalk as we have, again, a topic of very interesting discussion and information today that we trust you'll receive benefit from it, also to help gain a better understanding of where things are at in our nation and what you can do. Increasingly, we are seeing the president rule by executive order in such a way that circumvents the role of the legislative arm of the government. Here to discuss this matter with us today is Robert Romano, the senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. And Robert, nice to have you with us today.
Hey, it's great to be on. Thanks.
Robert, before we talk about some of the abuses that we are keenly aware of, or perhaps not aware of, but things that are going on, we're seeing the use of this executive order. I think before we get into some of those abuses, we need to really have some understanding of some basic principles. And first of all, if you would explain for us what are the three branches of government, and constitutionally, what is the role of each of those branches?
Sure. Well, the Congress, the legislative branch, makes the laws. The president, or the executive branch, executes the laws. And the judicial branch, the courts, they interpret the laws and will define the boundaries of what the limits of the law are. And if the executive branch, in particular, exceeds its boundaries in executing a law, or is executing a law which is unconstitutional, it's up to the courts to strike that law down under the premise of judicial review.
And why is the separation of powers so important?
Well, it's the underpinning of limited government by dispersing those three types of powers to not just one person, which is the way it was under a king. He would have all of those powers. That government will be less likely to overstep its bounds and encroach upon the liberties of the individual.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about another dimension, and that is the term known as executive orders. Is it true that the Constitution does not mention executive orders?
They don't mention executive orders, and I suppose in principle they should probably be okay if the executive order or the executive action that is being taken is in fact executing a law that exists. So, I try to think of an example. Maybe to look at a congressional authorization to use force, for example. Now, under the Constitution, the president is the commander-in-chief, and Congress is not going to authorize every tactic that the president or the generals may contrive to win a war effort. So there is some latitude there. So under similar guise, if Congress authorizes a particular actions or authority, usually there's some degree of discretion where under which the executive order could reside, and that wouldn't exceed the congressional authority. Where we get into problems is when executive actions exceed congressional intent.
Now, and that's what we want to talk about here today, because executive orders have been around a long time. I believe they go back even to presidential proclamations in some regards. But is an executive order law?
No, it's an action taken by the president to enforce a law. So that's not a law itself.
But why do we treat them as law?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure who's treating them as law per se. I mean, do we think of them as laws? Perhaps, but that's just, I would argue, a misunderstanding of what an executive order is. Per se, I don't know that they're treated under by courts as de facto law. I mean, they would the courts will clearly tell you that the Congress makes the laws, and that if the president's taking action that exceeds either his constitutional or statutory boundaries, they're going to strike it down.
And before we get into specifics as well, do you believe that the use of the executive order is an abuse of what it was intended today?
Well, clearly what Obama's doing and some recent actions, I believe, do go beyond what Congress has authorized, and I'll be prepared to make that case.
Great. And is this unique to President Obama?
not at all. The use of the executive order has expanded dramatically over the past century, and will likely continue to expand, and regardless of who's in the White House.
Now, recently, Robert, and by the way, folks, again, we're talking with Robert Romano from Americans for Limited Government. Recently, we've heard a common mantra that's come from President Obama. Congress has not acted, so I am. Some are calling it the "We Can't Wait" campaign. We can't wait, so here's what I'm going to do. Help us understand, if you would, make your case, what the president is doing then, perhaps, to circumvent Congress that abuses the executive order.
A perfect example is on October 24, the Federal Housing Finance Administration, under direction from the Obama administration, is allowing for refinancing government-backed mortgages that are over 25% underwater, otherwise 125% loan-to-value, but really what it means is negative equity. It's folks who owe more than 25% more than the home is actually worth. And the trouble with this is that the congressional statute that authorized the conservatorship by the FHFA for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac only allowed for refinancing up to 90% loan-to-value. And here they are going beyond 125% loan-to-value. And that was only for federally insured mortgages. And the scope of these refis that they're pushing now is for all mortgages that qualify under those guidelines. And that would clearly go beyond congressional intent. Now, what they'll argue, is that the statute also authorizes or mandates that the conservatorship be promulgated in a safe and sound manner, quote unquote, which is kind of financial speak for, make sure that it's always remaining solvent. So what they'll argue is by lowering the interest rates on the mortgages, those will have a slightly lower rate of default. Therefore, the cost of the lower interest payments will be offset by the fewer defaults, which to me is kind of a generous reading of the statute, considering that Congress did authorize refinancing for 90% loan-to-value on federally insured mortgages. And if they intended to have more than 125% loan-to-value on all mortgages, they would have said so, and they didn't.
Okay, so they didn't say so. So, I mean, how can what he signs his name to as far as a pen is concerned, how do we obey that? I mean, what justification is there for obedience to the presidential order here?
Well, in this case, it's the agency that is would, if assuming it were constitutional or did follow the statute, the agency would be obliged to follow the president's directive in executing a justly enacted law. But in this case, the FHFA, run by Edward DeMarco, is not fighting the Obama administration. They're not claiming it goes beyond congressional intent, the refis, that is. Interestingly, congressional Democrats have been demanding that the FHFA just simply write down the balance of underwater mortgages. And here DeMarco says, well, that goes beyond congressional authorization. We can't do that. Clearly they see some limits of their own in terms of what they can do. So they're at least, thankfully, still accepting the premise of limited government, even if it's a creative interpretation of the law that they're using right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, if we travel back just a couple of weeks ago, too, we saw the Senate reject the president's latest economic stimulus. And then we're hearing from the president saying, well, we'll be announcing a series of regulations to help the economy. In other words, they're going to, though Congress would not act on his stimulus bill, he's going to be taking elements of that bill and writing them as executive orders. I mean, isn't this abuse of it?
I think so. I think that Congress is, again, I mean, they have the power of the purse as well as the power to make laws. And if it was Congress's intent to spend more money than it takes in than was otherwise anticipated, they would vote to do so. And that for the president to take actions, particularly those that are going to result in a net deficit, therefore more deficit spending will be required. Therefore, the national debt is going to go up by more than it would have had he not taken the actions. I think he's definitely stepping on Congress's turf and the power of the purse. And I'd expect that the House and the Senate should, be a little bit annoyed about it, and hopefully they'll do something about it, because, here you have a runaway president who thinks he can do whatever he wants.
Have you other examples?
Well, then you have the student loan issue, where the terms of new terms for the loans for new borrowers were set to take effect in 2014 under the Sallie Mae nationalization that took place under the Obamacare legislation. And Obama's saying, well, we don't have to wait till 2014. We'll just do it right now. But if you read the statute, it only provides for the new terms for the new borrowers to apply starting in July of 2014. And there is no wiggle room. It doesn't say you could do so beforehand if certain criteria are met. So here, he is just making it up as he goes along, and just finds the 2014 enactment date, the sunrise provision, to be inconvenient to being able to hand out goodies to a favored constituency. In this case, college graduates who are looking for more favorable terms for loan consolidations as they struggle in this very weak job market that the Obama stimulus, I might add, has done nothing to turn around.
Well, and again, I guess I'm not hearing, Robert, any member of Congress stand up and say, I object to what's going on here.
I think some members in the House have been calling for investigations on the Republican side of the aisle, in particular to these new loan initiatives at the Obama administration, in particular attention to how much is it going to cost taxpayers. Okay,
so we have an investigation, but how does that stop his executive order from going forward?
Well, the only way to stop a president is when he is no longer president. Congress Congress can try to pass a law, for example, that would further define what the terms of, say, the mortgage programs are with the Federal Housing Finance Administration, or what Sallie Mae may and may not do, and then give that to the president, and then it would be subject to his signature. So this is usually when the president steps beyond the grounds of congressional authorization. Well, usually, what under our system of separation of powers, that's where the courts would typically be called in. So somebody needs to sue, and that somebody needs to have standing to sue in order to raise a legitimate objection that the courts will actually hear.
Okay, so is that a congressional somebody? Is that
a
general public somebody?
Well, assuming it's I would think that a member of the Congress itself could do so. Since it's their turf that's being stepped on. The agency could, but they're kind of complicit in the act. The recipients of the favorable terms of the loan, while it applies to them, they're not being forced into it. So you might have, and I'm not an attorney, so to get you a better answer on that, you probably need to ask one.
Okay. We're talking today with Robert Romano from Americans for Limited Government. We're talking today about presidential rule by executive order. We'll be right back.
Back to Genesis with creation researcher Dr. John Morris of the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, at dig sites, why do we find so many shark teeth?
Chris, sharks are unusual among fish in that they have no bones. They're made of cartilage, which quickly disintegrates upon death, and certainly does not fossilize well. Thus, we have very few fossil sharks. But we do have a lot of fossilized sharks' teeth, and some of them are huge, far larger than these sharks' teeth today. But sharks' teeth easily come loose from the shark's jaw, and they're replaced by other teeth. Thus, there's always an abundance of sharks' teeth. Now, I suspect that these fossilized sharks' teeth are from sharks which died in Noah's flood. But before they died, I suspect that these sharks were in a feeding frenzy. There was so much dying material in the waters of the flood, they could just eat themselves silly. So you see, Chris, once again, that the fossils point back to the flood and not to evolution.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more on creation, visit our website at www.icr.org.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Our guest today is Robert Romano, the senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. And today's topic, presidential rule by executive order. Just before we continue our topic, Robert, share a word with us, if you would, about Americans for Limited Government.
Americans for Limited Government, kind of like it sounds, we're an organization that believes that the federal government should operate within the limits which set forth by the federal Constitution and do nothing else. By doing so, we're going to best uphold liberty and property rights, and as well as life. And for that reason, it's the best form of government, the least imperfect, I think the founders would say, form of government, and certainly does much better than some of the tyrannies and monarchies where if you have a bad ruler, there's nothing you can do about it.
And for those who'd like more information about Americans for Limited Government, I know you've got quite an extensive website.
Sure. You can check us out at getliberty.org. That's GETLIBERTY.org.
Getliberty.org. Well, Robert, we're talking about this whole aspect of presidential rule by executive order, and I think to gain even further understanding on this, if you could enlighten us as to who is the Center for American Progress and what they have to do with this issue.
Well, they're a nonprofit organization, I suppose organizationally structured, not that dissimilar from Americans for Limited Government, although from the left wing of this spectrum. And what they recently advocated for was precisely what Obama's doing right now, that through executive orders and regulations, that there were several actions, especially in light of losing Democrat control of the House of Representatives in 2010, that could be taken beyond without any congressional say-so. And almost it reads like a playbook for what Obama is doing right now. And you can think of some prior egregious examples of executive actions as well as the ones that are just occurring now. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency issuing its carbon endangerment finding a couple of years back that allows the agency to read the Clean Air Act as applying to carbon dioxide emissions, even though the statute clearly has nothing to say on that matter. And even it really what it's leaning on is a Supreme Court decision saying that it did apply to carbon emissions. And what that's going to do is it's a backdoor cap-and-trade style regulations which are going to be issued from the EPA, and Congress is going to be hard-pressed to do anything about it unless it can get in and revise the Clean Air Act to say that this does not apply to carbon emissions, which would, and once signed into law, have the effect of undermining and nullifying the regulations that are being issued forth from EPA right now. It's incredibly dangerous. What that I'd say is one of the probably the most egregious example of a unilateral executive action superseding the intent of Congress in American history.
The Democratic Socialist of America, or DSA, has founded a group called the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Pretty large caucus, I understand, in the U.S. Congress. And I understand that they also, this Congressional Progressive Caucus, is one that pushes, because of the changeover that happened in the congressional race here in 2010, are pushing for further actions by use of executive order.
Well, that's hardly surprising. I suppose the more radical one becomes within their own political party, the more they're going to want to sidestep the political process in order to see their agenda enacted. And that can cut both ways. I mean, you've had, over history there have been extreme left parties and there have been far right parties as well. But the point is that only a system under a limited government where you're going to obey the checks and balances set forth by the Constitution are you going to be able to avoid that stuff. And as that fidelity breaks down, the types of government and the types of governmental actions, the people willing to commit to those actions without any guidance of law are going to be far more radical than what the people voted for, and are going to defy any reason or logic of, well, gee, you can't do this. This is, we never voted for this, and so it goes far beyond the consent of the governed. And I think that should be pretty troubling. And just, that's the socialists in Congress, and that's what they want. So I suppose the farther left you go on the political spectrum, the more wild the ideas are going to be about what they would prefer to do via executive action if they can't get it done via legislation.
Americans for Limited Government, in a recent press release, have alleged that unions were allowed to not only shape federal policy, but also to guide the president's pen in the creation of Executive Order number 13522. Let me ask you, Robert, is this conjecture, or do you have some proof?
Well, the order reads pretty much itself, but Americans for Limited Government did a Freedom of Information Act request, to which we did receive a reply, and what you discover in the formulation of the executive order by the Executive Office of the President and the Office of Management and Budget is that the unions across the country, even non-government public sector unions, so therefore private sector unions, were involved in the formulation of this executive order, and they were providing guidance. Now, this applies to federal civil service, and what it allows them to do, the federal civil servants and the unions there, is basically to complain about pretty mundane things, because the collective bargaining is not in place. So therefore, what do they do instead to kind of gum up the works? Is complain about do you have a window view, or what is the dimensions of your office, or how closely are you located to the cooler?
Well, that's collective bargaining without being called collective bargaining.
More or less, and it's they call them labor management forums, and so now. And even to the extent that there is collective bargaining, what it allows is for workplace decisions that go far beyond the arrangement that's already in place to basically you have to be discussed between the manager and the union reps. It's a way of sandwiching in decisions that otherwise wouldn't even be under the purview of a collective bargaining arrangement. And this was just done unilaterally by the Obama administration in the executive order that you stipulated, 13522.
Yet another issue. Yesterday, the president of Americans for Limited Government, Bill Wilson, brought to light that unions are raiding a fund that was set up in a Health and Human Services program that was supposed to be for targeted at retirees. What's happening with that?
Well, Senator Mike Enzi announced that it was a Government Accountability Office report. And so essentially what you say is that the program intended for early retirees is being basically looted by 24 organizations, including unions and including government agencies. And again, this appears to go beyond what the purpose of the program was. So I think put together, you got EPA, you got the Federal Housing Finance Administration, you've got early retiree programs, student loan programs, and, these all cost, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on an annual basis in taxpayer money. And they're just having a field day with it. EPA, et cetera. That's going to, if they get around to imposing their carbon tax, that's going to impose perhaps as much as $1 trillion carbon tax on the American economy. And so what you have in the big picture here is a government that's run amok. With this most recent union and agency looting of the early retiree program, the GAO report says that $2.9 billion of the money has been put into the program, and a majority of that's gone to government entities and union health plans. I don't see how that helps out early retirees, but clearly the limits that are in place are eroding before our eyes.
Wow. Robert Romano with us. Robert, let me ask you this. When we talk about this presidential rule by executive order, I feel the American public is like, sitting in a car on a roller coaster ride. It's like, hang on and brace yourself. What can an average person do regard to this? I mean, we see the abuse that's going on, whether it's this administration or a previous administration in years gone by. What is it that the average person can do in regard to the abuse that we're witnessing with the merging together of powers, where we see the executive branch just taking for themselves legislative freedom?
Well, elections do matter. Let me cite an example here so that folks get the idea. In 2008, the Democrats basically won a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and obviously had a majority in the House, and they won the White House. And what ended up happening was, do you remember the Dodd-Frank legislation? What this put in place was something called an orderly liquidation fund, where Congress set about, through statute, to create an executive apparatus, which would be a permanent bailout fund, what they call the Permanent Resolution Authority. And what this will be funded by is assessments levied on 60 bank holding and insurance companies with $50 billion or greater in consolidated assets. Now, those costs will be passed on to consumers of financial products, which is everyone. So if you see higher debit fees or monthly surcharges on your debit account, or higher credit card fees or higher interest rates for that matter, that's what it's all going to. Is this fund, which is going to be used and run by the FDIC, such that if a financial company gets in trouble again, they don't have to go back to Congress for another TARP. What they'll do is just implement, just solely via the executive branch, a resolution, and that could be a liquidation of the company, which is what the statute does stipulate, but it could also mean a bailout under a different name, which would mean liquidation followed by a new bridge company being created, and just put a new name on the company, and they get fresh funding from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation via these assessments, via the fund. And this bill could have been stopped. Certainly, there were there were very few Republicans that supported it. Unfortunately, Scott Brown of Massachusetts was one of them. So elections matter. And if Republicans had a few more members in the Senate, they could have had a filibuster, and they could have stopped the permanent bailout mechanism from being put into place. That's kind of where the rubber meets the road, but also shows the extent to which when the Democrat Party, when they have full control of Congress, what types of things are they going to try to put in place? Look at Obamacare, another huge example, where they set up this Medicare Payments Advisory Council that's going to basically change the outlays to Medicare recipients willy-nilly, what Governor Sarah Palin had called a death panel. Well, Congress should probably be determining what the outlays through the Medicare program are going to be, not some independent panel of experts who think they know better. No matter how dire the situation fiscally of this country is, we don't need to outsource it to panels of experts or super committees or to or to any agency or unelected part of the government. I think that this step away from the consent of the governed through the elected branches is extremely dire. The experiment in representative government is only a few hundred years old and really is the exception to the rule. The rule has always been by unelected tyrants.
Let's hear what America has to say. Folks, if you have a question you'd like to ask, a comment you would like to make, we're opening the phone lines right now. Our number, 1-800-733-9829. Your questions and comments about presidential rule by executive order. We'll be right back.
Perhaps you're a person that is active on the issues of today. And while these things are necessary, there is nothing more important than your personal relationship to Jesus Christ. Have you met Him as your personal Savior? All the issues we face on earth pale in comparison to the real issue of your relationship to God. What really matters is eternity, and we hope that you're ready for it. I'd like to send you a brochure that is absolutely free. This will help you to consider this very important matter. It's entitled, Where Will You Spend Eternity? It's brief, it's to the point, and it helps you to understand the urgency of having a personal relationship to Jesus Christ. If you'd like to receive a free copy of this pamphlet, right now pick up your phone and call 800-729-9829 and ask for the brochure. That's 800-729-9829. Call now.
This is Crosstalk. It's heard each weekday at the same time here on the VCY American Network, bringing together issues that impact your faith, impact your family, impact your freedoms here across this land. Our guest today is Robert Romano, Senior Editor with Americans for Limited Government. Their website is getliberty.org. That's getliberty.org. Taking your comments here today, if you would like to share your viewpoints on the presidential rule by executive order, do you believe it's gone too far? Let's hear your comments on it. Maybe you have a question on executive orders. Our number here, 800-733-9829. That's 1-800-733-9829. Taking your phone calls today. Let's begin with Ty in Wisconsin. You're on the air, Ty.
Yeah, I think it's gone too far, and I do have a couple of questions here. It seems like he's setting a precedent to set things in order here to become like a dictator with no one being able to stop him. You had that senator, I think, out in North Carolina or Pennsylvania talking about let's do away with elections so we can just get down to business.
Governor Bev Perdue, North Carolina. Yes, she had said that maybe perhaps Congress should do away with the elections for the next 2 years so they can get the jobs bill enacted or something like that. Mm-hmm. And she claimed to be joking, but I'm not laughing. And, Peter Orszag, Obama's former budget director, basically said that our institutions need to be a little bit less democratic, again, so that the Obama administration can get its agenda enacted. How convenient.
Hello?
Go ahead, Ty.
Yeah, then the other part is that I thought there's been a number of states that have, please explain to me how this process works, have already said Obamacare is unconstitutional. It seems like aren't parts of it already being enacted? How is he getting away with this and doing this? And what's to stop him from putting some order if he gets thrown out of there to have the next president stuck with Obamacare?
Well, about half of the states are suing in federal court to overturn the Obamacare statute. While the idea of nullification is popular, and it's one I personally support, the process and the system which we live in, and what the states are doing is suing, and they've and federal a couple of the courts have said that the individual mandate is unconstitutional. One of them said that because Congress would have never constructed the law without the individual mandate the way it did, that the entire law was en masse unconstitutional. A couple of other courts have said that the individual mandate is constitutional. What does this mean? All these different appeals courts saying different things. Is that we're going to the Supreme Court where they will settle once and for all whether the individual mandate itself, forcing people to buy health care, which, but mind you, I, with all due respect to Mitt Romney, he says that in Massachusetts this is a states' rights issue, but you can't find a state anywhere in the country that forces anybody to buy anything other than health insurance in Massachusetts. So I don't think this is any legitimate power for either the federal or the state government to be enacting, but the Supreme Court will settle that. We could at ALG we believe that the Congress clearly went beyond the intent of the interstate commerce law and trying to claim that forcing people to buy health care and their decision of whether or not to, or the fact that they didn't, which is a passive activity. You're not doing anything when you don't go buy something. Somehow affects interstate commerce is just about as specious and overreaching an interpretation of the Commerce Clause that's ever been attempted, and hopefully, I expect the court to overturn it.
Thank you for the call. Matter of fact, we understand next week the U.S. Supreme Court has a conference to determine which of these Obamacare suits they're going to take, or if they are going to take. It seems they're going to have to do it, though, Robert, because we do have conflicting responses from the courts, that they are going to need to settle this issue here, or we're really going to have chaos.
I agree, and it is their responsibility, and I don't expect Chief Justice John Roberts to drop the ball on an issue that is so important, where you have the states and the Obama administration both saying that the Supreme Court needs to settle this issue once and for all, and I expect them to rule the right way. As a matter of fact, I believe the law will be overturned with any. Whether or not to strike it down en masse, we can hope. The basis for doing so, that's debatable, or I'll say that's controversial, even amongst conservative legal jurists who see that matter both ways, whether or not you could strike down a law en masse.
And as Ty was pointing out there, the caller, is that even despite the fact that these are going through the courts have struck aspects of this down. I mean, Obamacare is going full force through this country right now.
That's true, and that is part of the separation of powers there until the court has finally settled this. And the reason they did the appeals courts is precisely for this reason, where the lower courts have an opportunity to really work the issues out, and by the time it gets to the Supreme Court's desk, it's pretty well founded what the arguments are going to be, and potentially even what the outcome might be, and therefore which parts of a constitutional jurisprudence will be affected, such that the court knows what the conceivable outcomes will be should they take on a case.
Let's go to Germantown. Lynn, you're on the air.
Hi, I just have a question. Wasn't it during the big Obamacare thing where abortion was part of it, that he signed some sort of executive order that everybody said was really not worth the paper it was written on, to try and appease the people that were, saying abortion shouldn't be covered by taxpayers? And so if that's the case, and that isn't worth the paper it was written on, that executive order, then how powerful are these executive orders anyway?
Good question, Robert.
I'm actually not familiar with that executive order, so I'd hate to speculate on what effect it may have. Or,
this was actually part of the.
I mean, if you're making up an order as president that says that funding does apply to this activity, for example. And there was nothing in law that said so. That would be a violation.
Yeah, this was really part of the great compromise in order to woo certain senators, Democratic senators, to come along who were pro-life senators, stating that I will sign this executive order so that abortion funds will not be, no funds go for abortion through this Affordable Health Care Act. And we see this thing kind of flying out the window, whereby other executive orders seem to have the full, weight of law to it. So interesting contradiction there. Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate you bringing that forth. Let's go next to Eastern Texas. In Austin, you're on the air.
Hi. I was looking at your definition of limited government, and I think I see it as more, you're defining it as more to your own personal view, because I agree with that we should have limited government, but I think you're looking at it from one perspective. Now, if you look at the size of the government, we have a big government, and you can use one to control a government that is as big as the one we have. And also, when you talk about Obama signing executive government, or whoever the president is using executive power to sign certain issues, that we have a bunch of senators that don't agree. And I remember you saying that it doesn't matter how the situation is, that we should allow the government to work its way out. But we can't. If you have a bunch of senators or lawmakers who cannot agree on simple things, and there has to be compromise. That's why the government is what it is. There has to be checks and balances. There has to be compromise. If you have the Republicans that do not want to agree on anything, and you have the Democrats that do not want to agree on anything, you can have a government. So here you are criticizing the Democrats for going their way, and you're not criticizing the Republicans for wanting a certain thing. You can't have a government as huge as what we have today being ruled by one party's perspective. So you have to have compromise. Okay. It doesn't matter what your political aspirations are.
Thank you, Austin. We'll have him address this. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, my perspective on it is that the size of government is, clearly a function of going far beyond the constitutional limits that were set forth. And it may be inconvenient or inefficient in people's opinions that the government is of this size is not functioning properly without the Republicans just kind of going along with it, no matter how egregious a violation it is. That's a perfect argument for not having a constitution, as a matter of fact. And I hate to say it, but that's that people do believe that, and those are, I hate to say it, those are dangerous arguments for something that is not constitutional, and it really has no limit. I mean, do people want a powerful executive that can embody the will of the people? If that sounds familiar, that's the basic ideological underpinning of an ideology called fascism.
Thank you for the call. Port Huron, Michigan. Harry, you're on the air.
Hey, fellas. I think it depends on the issue. I'll give you an issue. What about, for example, pro-life? I think it would be wonderful to have a pro-life president in the White House issuing an executive order saying that unborn children will be protected from here on. Now, I think it depends on the issue. Congress has proven they can't get anything done, and they've proven that they don't care what we think anyway. So, I think it depends on what the issue is.
Thank you for your comment, Harry. Does the president have such authority, Robert?
Well, the court, if the states had any authority, the courts took that away. And I'm just kind of gaming it out in my head here. What would happen if that were, if a president attempted that? I imagine it would wind up back in the courts. And if they, assuming they'd have to revisit Roe v. Wade. What ended up? I mean, originally that was a state's issue. So, the only way, if the court were to go back and revisit that issue, the effect would that would automatically be the effect of an executive order. I mean, they'd have an injunction on it inside of a Hollywood minute, but then the courts would be revisiting the issue. They'd be forced to, and your guess is as good as mine how that turns out.
And let's go to another call in Michigan. Dan, thanks for calling. You're on the air.
Two statements. Michigan's experiencing something right now. They're trying to build a bridge to nowhere over to Canada and force it down everybody's throat. I wonder if your guest would be so bold as to clearly define, given the current circumstances here in America and around the world, clearly define the intent of the Second Amendment as we know it in the Constitution and why it is there.
Okay. Second Amendment is obviously a protection for people, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's for purposes of self-defense. It can, whether that be against fellow citizens or anyone that's going to pose a danger.
Yeah, the court certainly has upheld that as an individual right.
That's right, and and clearly, the founders were, what did they have to deal with? They had to deal with the redcoats and the British Crown that was, quite tyrannical, and so one reason they wanted to protect the right to bear arms was in case a tyrannical form of government ever took over the nation that they were founding. Folks would need the ability to defend themselves against an authoritarian regime.
Okay.
Pretty straightforward.
Okay, thanks for your call. Our number here at the Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. We're straying a little bit here from the executive order, but let's get back on here, the executive order issue and presidential rule by executive order. Our number, 800-733-9829. I understand, though, that there was an executive order signed that impacted some of the states along the Mexican border as it relates to the increase of penalties for certain gun violations and adding steps to the background check for legal gun ownership, that being done through executive order. And folks, the issues continue on and on. Let's take your calls when we come back from the break. 800-733-9829.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewweekend.com. Today, contemplative prayer, breath prayers, centering prayers, soaking prayers, whatever you want to call it, is being promoted even inside, quote, evangelical churches, end quote. In fact, Richard Foster, a writer who teaches contemplative prayer, talks about how you can actually literally encounter Jesus. Is this biblical? No, it's not biblical at all. Nowhere in the scriptures do we see that we are to physically encounter Jesus through our prayer life. Nowhere do we see that we're to enter into the silence, enter into the quietness, and encounter God, or encounter Jesus. In fact, 1 Peter 1 verse 8 does not say whom we see whenever we want through visualization. It says, whom having not seen you love, though you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible, full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. End quote. Christians are not commanded to try to physically see Jesus.
We're speaking today with Robert Romano from Americans for Limited Government. Their website is getliberty.org, where you can obtain more information not only on this, but multiple other issues on limited government. Getliberty.org. And today we're talking about presidential rule by executive order, taking your calls at 800-733-9829. And we're going next to Atmore, Alabama, where Maxine's been holding. Thank you for your patience, Maxine. You're on the air.
Yes, I was wondering if the Supreme Court should rule that Obamacare is unconstitutional. Could our next president still veto it, or would he be bound by it?
The court would, if the court overturns the Obamacare law, whether just the individual if it's just the individual mandate, then the rest of the law is going to stand, and the president, under our limited system of separation of powers, would be obliged to uphold to carry forward the rest of it. And if the folks wanted to get rid of it, they have to repeal it. And if they strike it down en masse, then regardless if it's Obama in there winning re-election, he would be obliged not to enforce the law.
Okay, Maxine?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your call. I see a couple open lines now, 800-733-9829 to Winona, Minnesota. Linda, you're on the air.
Hi. See, I just wanted to comment about a march that is going to be in Washington, D.C. It's a Patriots Call to Action. It is headed by the veterandefenders.org, veterandefenders.org.
Oh, okay, Linda, do you have a comment pertaining to our topic today?
It's just basically about the march in Washington.
Okay, thank you so much. Just want to keep tuned to our topic here on the matter of executive orders. I know there's much going on, and we have other open forum programs, but this issue to be rather important as we consider it. If things go unchecked, where is this going to lead us, Robert?
Good question. That's anyone's guess. I mean, the thing that we pay very close attention to right now are events that are unfolding in Europe right now. And the reason for that is as they struggle to come up with a permanent resolution authority to permanently bail out the creditors of troubled sovereigns like Greece and Portugal. The reason we're keeping close tabs on that is because what may end up happening is an organ of the federal government, perhaps the Federal Reserve, via arbitrary unilateral action may step in to bail out those nations. So where does this end? I mean, just look at how much it's costing. This is trillions of dollars at play there, and certainly was the case when the housing bubble popped and they engaged in quite unilateral actions to purchase over $1 trillion of mortgage-backed securities that were sold all over the world. And so that's something for folks who are concerned about what unilateral actions might the U.S. government be engaged in presently. Certainly keep an eye on Europe and what effect it's going to have here and what actions they may take to prop up financial institutions once again.
Let's go next to Joshua in Pensacola, Florida. Go ahead, Joshua. You're on the air.
Yeah, we're talking about the health care issue, and this seems very interesting. I'd like to find out when would they appeal it and how long would it take for us to do some action about that?
Well, it has been appealed. It's already, as we mentioned already, Joshua, it has conflicting responses by the courts right now. They have worked their way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Next week, the U.S. Supreme Court is holding a conference to determine which cases they're going to be hearing, and so we will not know anything until probably some days after the conference as to the action that's going forth here at that point. So that's something we'll certainly continue to monitor. Let's go to Idaho, and Jeff, you're on the air.
Yeah, I just had a question about, in fact, an executive order, if it's made by the president and violates, I would say, constitutional right, like they're not allowing the governance of us, the people, and our voices, doesn't that at some point violate the Constitution and possibly allow for impeachment based off of an executive order? Is that even possible?
Well, impeachable offense, as Gerald Ford once said, is whatever Congress says it is, in which case you need two-thirds of the House of Representatives to basically charge the president with an impeachable what they say the impeachable offense was, and that could be anything. It could be an executive order that far exceeded the boundaries of congressional intent, high crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, that's pretty broad, sweeping statement of what a president can be impeached for. So I'd say, yeah, if that was Congress's, if they viewed that as a high crime and a misdemeanor, they could go right ahead and impeach the president over that.
So in his oath of office, does he not promise us to represent us and our voices? So if he's making executive orders that are superseding or removing that, would that not potentially be impeachable?
That's what I just said.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Thank you for your call. To Russell in Portage, Wisconsin, you're on the air.
Hello. Yes, the recent talking points of the president not to enforce DOMA and to take that into, just say, well, the next president was to say, well, I'm just not going to enforce Obamacare.
Okay. Now, yes. Now, the Defense of Marriage Act, the enforcement there, and the unilateral decision not to even defend it, is kind of it's yet another example. And we could go on hours and hours and talk about how the executive branch, in particular under the Obama administration, is going beyond congressional intent. If he doesn't like the Defense of Marriage Act, his party was in control of Congress for 2 years with a filibuster-proof majority. They could have just repealed it if that was their intent, and they didn't do it. And so to appease a constituency, he's going ahead and saying, "Well, I'm just not going to pay attention to that law," and that clearly defies the separation of powers here. I mean, he can disagree with the law all he wants, and that's perfectly fine. But as president, even if you disagree with the law, you are obliged to execute it, and that's. It should be outrageous to Americans whether or not they support the Defense of Marriage Act.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Russell, for the call. And just keep in mind, as we did yesterday's Crosstalk program, that Thursday morning the Senate Judiciary Committee is going to be casting a vote on legislation that, in essence, does repeal DOMA. And you can find more information at crosstalkamerica.com. Well, I apologize to other callers on hold, but have about 15 seconds. Final thought you'd like to share with the listeners, Robert?
Limited government is an experiment, and it's something that it's an experiment that could fail if we cannot restore constitutional governance and the separation of powers. And people need to demand that of their representatives. There may be nothing more important that they can do for their children and their grandchildren.
Robert, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, you have a good day.
Robert Romano has been our guest, senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. Their website, getliberty.org. Thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us